I don't know what happened here. Why isn't that showing up?
Will, they're asking if you could put your image up.
Yeah, I will.
He's just editing something real quick.
Yeah, I'm putting the right date on the slide. So pathetic.
He's got it up. So we're good to go, and then, oh, you're gonna use the handheld. He's gonna use handheld 5.
Steele, you're over there. Okay, I'm going to hand you this. You want to sit maybe right here? Yeah, and then I'll bring you.
Okay, that sounds good. 5 minutes, right?
5 minutes. Steele's going to do his thing this morning tonight, so if you can cut him off.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I will just cut you off. I will do so with much gusto.
I was going to say, good luck.
I'm very excited.
Good luck. You'll have to pry the mic from my cold.
Good evening, everyone. Good evening. Welcome back from spring break to Edible Ed 101. A lot happened while we were gone. The trees burst into bloom. The camellias unfolded. The western redbud is... This only lasts. What's interesting about spring to me is that there's a greenness, there's a fresh greenness that erupts on the tips of all the leaves, and these trees that you never thought would produce a brilliant flower just put on a show. And this is one of my favorite trees. And these blossoms give way to leaves in just a day or two. So, like everything, it's a fleeting scene, brilliant, bright, and fleeting. Also, roses and irises already in bloom. Tonight, we have a really important and interesting conversation tonight, why representation matters in food media, and it's going to be hosted by my friend and colleague, Naomi Starkman, who I'm going to introduce in a few moments. She's the founding editor and editor-in-chief of Civil Eats, which is one of our most important sources of credible, high-integrity information about the food system. And I hope you'll learn more about that tonight from Naomi. I was thinking back to last week, or 2 weeks ago when we were together, when we had Alice Waters and Bob Kennard with us. And that was such a fantastic discussion, and it reminded me of a couple things. One is that true innovation and evolution of new ideas and new really takes root in collaboration. I think the chef-farmer collaboration that we were treated to was really important. And it's interesting because in the media always likes to celebrate individual heroes. I once asked the editor-in-chief of Inc. magazine, or maybe it was Fast Company magazine, why do you only put one entrepreneur on the cover of your magazine each month? Because all of these companies are always started by more than one person, or there's always a team behind them. And I remember him telling me, because single faces sell more magazines. So it's another example of sort of oversimplification of the message. But Alice and Bob have had I think it was a 30-year partnership now, and quite extraordinary. And for me, everything that we'd learned to date this semester came together in their presentation. I was thinking about our first class with the tour of the regenerative farm with Jack Algier, and then Dr. Daphne Miller's presentation about health from the ground up. And Bob really brought that to life with his notion of physical completeness. And then we touched on aspects of the Farm Bill. We came to appreciate more why the use of fumigants in an industry is not a good idea, that Dr. Julie Guthman presented to us. Anyway, I was thinking a lot about that path and Bob's path and Bob's commitment. And one of the things I wanted to have you treated to this evening was a presentation from another fellow student. I think I mentioned to you that for the remaining few classes that we have together, we're going to feature a graduate student that's working on something interesting in the food system. And tonight, I'm really thrilled to introduce to you Steele Lorenz, who's a second-year MBA student here at the Haas School of Business. Steele, the floor is yours.
Thank you. So I am pretty nervous, actually. I took this class or sat in for a number of the presentations last year, and it's kind of crazy that I am speaking here right now. So forgive me. But Will asked me to share a little bit of my story and how I came to work in agriculture, and I'm going to try and compress that down into a couple of minutes. But essentially, I was an undergrad, like many of you, at the University of Minnesota, and was exposed to a class somewhat like this that was, instead of focused on what the opportunities and kind of moral high ground is in food, it was focused on developmental work, specifically in India. And so I was in a class, and I thought, man, I could really start a business to change some things. And the year that I took it, it was focused on water security in India. So after I graduated, I actually moved to India to start a business that would change, I thought, water security and how Indian freshwater was consumed. For those of you that are not familiar with agriculture in India, which I assume is everybody, about 80% of India's fresh water is used for agriculture, for irrigation purposes. So I started a company that was designed to distribute efficient irrigation equipment to smallholding farmers, which were the majority of agriculture at the time, and still is. Spent 6 years doing it and realized one day that I was just not making any impact. We had worked with about 6,000 farms. We estimated that were 42 million farms that were irrigating in India, and I realized that while my solution, my business felt good, we were not actually ever going to be able to scale to make an impact in agriculture or in freshwater consumption. And so I left the business and I came back here to study my MBA, to spend some time thinking about what I had done wrong and maybe even transition away from agriculture. And I was in this class last year, and Paul Hawken spoke. And I know that you guys have talked at least a little bit about Project Drawdown and the work that Paul Hawken is doing, and many others. And I was reminded at the incredible power that agriculture has, not just to produce the food that we eat, but also change the environment in which we live in. I had been focused on water in the past, but all of a sudden there were all of these ideas about how agriculture could sequester carbon and change how we were, thinking about greenhouse gas emissions. And so I got really excited about agriculture again, despite having thought that I would like to transition out. And I started looking for companies that could help me make an environmental difference in a way that I had not been able to do on a much grander scale than my original business. And so I found Farmers Business Network. Farmers Business Network has 7,000 farmers on a digital platform where they collectively share agronomic and economic information so that they can make better business decisions. Covers 30 million acres. In 6 years, I had covered 6,000 acres in India. So I realized that all of a sudden, this platform was something that, true scale could be achieved with if the right ideas were in place. And so I spent last summer building the business model for them to incentivize their huge farmer base to deploy more sustainable practices that are largely recognized to sequester carbon, things like reduced tillage or no tillage, planting of cover crops. And we were actually able to, through the project that I did, find a buyer of these grains that was interested in supporting that and paying for that. And so, kind of long story short, I have created a position there at Farmers Business Network where it's now my sole job to create a market-based incentive for farmers, traditional farmers, not necessarily organic farmers, but traditional farmers to deploy practices that actually sequester carbon. And we are signing up very marquee buyers, not only in food, which I know this classes focused on, but also in ethanol and in feed, which is where the majority of agriculture products go to in the U.S. And so Will wanted me to touch a little bit on how my education was shaped by, I'm getting pulled off. But he wanted me to talk a little bit about how my education was shaped, or my path was shaped by my education opportunities. And I think that I wouldn't be working on agriculture, and I wouldn't be exposed to these ideas if not for classes like these. And so I would encourage you all to think about not only how this is just, an interesting class and something that you're passionate about, but how this really could shape your future career, because I know for sure that it did mine. So thank you.
Thanks, Steele. I always like to update you a little bit on the news. This was a story in Politico, I think, this week. Inside the race to build the burger of the future. It says, President Trump says Democrats and environmental wackos are waging a war on beef, but corporations, not politicians or activists, are leading the post-meat revolution. So it's interesting now, food is skyrocketing right into the center of the political debate for the next election. And Elizabeth Warren came boldly forward this week and declared that she, as part of one of her campaign stands, is going to address concentration of power in the agriculture and food industries. And I think Bernie Sanders is coming out to put that in his platform as well. It's just interesting now to see how vibrant this topic of food is, how food security, food access, and the climate impacts of food, the health impacts. I read this week, too, that Americans actually borrow $80 billion a year to pay for medical expenses. Many of those medical expenses generated by behaviors and choices that have to do with their food and diets and access. And so it's interesting how I think I just wanted to mention this given tonight's topic, that whether we can hold these politicians sort of accountable and keep this topic of food really on the agenda, and not have it just be kind of trivialized. Someone once said, the pen is mightier than the sword, and that words and ideas really matter. Tonight, our topic is really, we've got three really amazingly vibrant and important voices in food with us tonight, and it's really my pleasure to turn the class over to Naomi Starkman. Naomi is trained as a lawyer, realized that food and eating is a civil act, became a farmer and a journalist, and then decided she saw an unmet need and recognized an opportunity that there really wasn't a source for conveying stories around the interconnectedness of food and justice in our lives. So she founded Civil Eats. It's now in its 10th year. It's quite amazing for an independent media platform. And it's supported entirely by donations from its readers and supporters. It's near and dear to the food community that has given birth to this class. And it's Naomi is the one person that has been here now all 3 years in a row that I've hosted the class. So that's a great honor for me. So please welcome Naomi Starkman.
Why don't you come up? We'll all go up together. Hi, everybody. Good evening. It's my great pleasure to be here with all of you. This is one of my favorite classes to come and talk to you all with, and I have had the great pleasure of being here beyond Wool's class, Michael Pollan's version of edible education, also Mark Bittman's, and I was talking earlier with Soleil, we were both saying it would have been so amazing for us to have had a class like this. So you guys are so lucky to be able to take a class with such an esteemed professor like Will Rosenzweig. I have some incredible people here tonight that I am so lucky to talk to, people who I really respect and admire, people I consider heroes, who are in their writing and their thinking making a huge difference in what we think about when we think about food. And I'm going to introduce them all, and then we're going to have a conversation, and then we'll open it up to questions and answers from all of you. I'm going to start with you, Luz, in the middle. Luz Calvo received their PhD in the history of consciousness at UC Santa Cruz, and also holds an MA in political science and AB in politics from Princeton. Dr. Calvo teaches courses in Latino studies, gender and sexuality studies, food justice, and ethnic studies. Their current research focuses on decolonization. Dr. Calvo, along with their partner, Dr. Catriona R. Esquivel at San Francisco State, is the author of Decolonize Your Diet, Plant-Based Recipes for Health and Healing. And I'm really glad Dr. Calvo is here today. Please welcome Diet. Soleil Ho, we're very pleased to have Soleil with us. She's a freelance food, culture, and travel writer. And
Not anymore.
She's no longer freelance. She is full-time now because she's the new food critic at the San Francisco Chronicle. Yeah. Best decision they ever made.
Yes.
She was just nominated for a Beard Award for her incredible podcast, The Race to Sandwich. And in fact, on your assignment for this week was the episode that they just were nominated for, Erasing Black Barbecue, so congratulations for that. She's written about assimilation, food, and her pro-feminist love for Sailor Moon and the curious culinary legacy of Asian immigration in Mexico. And we're really happy to have you here today.
Thanks.
Last but not least is my dear friend and colleague, Stephen Satterfield. Stephen is a food writer, a publisher, an entrepreneur, a public speaker, an event and multimedia producer. He is the founder of Whetstone Magazine, a seasonal publication on food origins, culture, and culinary anthropology. And he was also a somm. He's one of the few people we know who has moved from the world of food into writing in this particular way. He worked at NOPA in San Francisco as a manager for many years, where he also created Nopalize, which was a multimedia platform generating hundreds of original pieces of writing. And it's really a great pleasure to sit next to you, Stephen.
Thank you.
So I'm going to sort of start this conversation, and I really hope you guys also engage with each other and make this more of like an interactive conversation. But I want to start with you, Luz, because your book is really important. And actually, Will, I just realized I don't have the clicker. Okay, thank you. I need it for Luz's slides. Thank you so much. Thanks. And I hope okay. Luz, sorry about that. I want to talk to you a little bit about your book. I want to ask a little bit about your book. If you could describe to the class your book, how you came upon the idea of the book, and also what you've learned since you wrote the book.
Great. So we published Decolonize Your Diet, Plant-Based Mexican-American Recipes for Health and Healing in 2015. We published with a small press, Arsenal Pulp, which is a Canadian government-supported press. After being turned down by all of the food, the big publishers of cookbooks, we were told that our book was too niche and too academic sounding. At the time, I think the discourse of decolonization was just kind of rising up, and we saw it and we were participating in it, but it seemed like way outside of like what could be marketable. But we really believed in our project, and I think the basic premise of our book is that Mexican people in the United States, and in particular our immigrant communities, hold this like such important knowledge about food and health that is unrecognized. And that we lose our attachment to that knowledge and wisdom to our own peril. And that as we assimilate into American culture and start eating an standard American diet, our health suffers. And so there were many, many articles that we read on the Latino immigrant paradox, which is a big body of research in public health that shows that Mexican immigrants actually have better health on all measures than US-born Latinos and the US population in general. And so that seemed like a really important message to get out, both as a way of uplifting immigrant communities and their knowledge, but also as a way to reclaim our health and contest, I guess, the white supremacist kind of ideology that has always shamed us for our food and told us that our food was not healthy and not as good as eating a kale salad. So that's kind of the premise of the book, and we take both a storytelling kind of, we start with storytelling and then we discuss research. We develop our theory of decolonizing in relation to food, and then we share recipes. So that's basically the book. And I also teach a class at Cal State East Bay called Decolonize Your Diet, which was developed alongside the book. And one issue that I have seen come up over and over again in teaching the class is this kind of uneasy relationship to shame. And that when we're talking about food, we often, and healthy food, there's a way that the discourse can become really shaming to people who think like, well, I don't eat healthy. And so one of the places where I've been learning and really kind of engaging in learning from social media is around fat activists, and in particular a group called Nalgona Positivity Pride, which is kind of hard to translate, but Nalgona maybe means big butt. And in particular, this is Gloria Lucas, who is the founder of Nalgona Positivity Pride. And she has a big social media platform. And one of the things that she put out, which really caused me to reflect, is the next slide, which is her, you are in a body positive zone. And one of the things that was not allowed was food shaming, and in particular, judging food options or eating habits, or health or concern trolling, which is keep your health advice to yourself. And so then kind of thinking this through in relation to our concern and on our for healthy eating has just created a lot of questions, which I don't have answers to necessarily, but which I think about, so I now start my classes with this discussion about shame. Because I think it's really important to draw all of these kind of pieces together before we even start talking about healthy food. And one thing that comes up in my classes is that it's not just shame around body size, but that there's a lot of shame around the food that is associated with poverty for Latino immigrants. And so kind of undoing that and talking about it and bringing it into the open is a really, I think, important first step of undoing it.
And just sort of by voicing it, do you feel like you're addressing some of that shame?
Absolutely. I mean, instead of just having it be an undercurrent that I can see people squirming and feeling uncomfortable, trying to raise it as a way. And some of my students have really, grasped onto it and shared with the class stories of their kids being shamed for being chubby by their pediatricians, for the way WIC programs enforce kind of a healthy eat, telling them they should be putting broccoli on their pizzas as a way to eat healthy, and just kind of that lack of cultural sensitivity or relevance, or just the, I think, the imposition of a white supremacist way of thinking on people from various institutions that my Latino students have to interact with in their daily lives.
One of the things that we talked about before this class was sort of your seeing this deeper connection as well after writing the book around indigenous cultures and the Latinx population, and I was hoping you could say a few more words about that.
Yeah, and this is really tricky at this moment, so I don't know how many people are following, but Mecha just this weekend voted to change, and how many people know who Mecha is? So some of you. So Mecha is Movimiento Estudiantil Chicano de Aztlán, which is the historic Chicano student movement organization, and there's chapters on most campuses, and it's been since the 1960s. And they decided to change their name to eliminate Chicano and to eliminate Aztlán. And it's a super profound moment because Aztlán is the mythical homeland of the Mexican people, but it also erases the fact of the particular indigenous land that we're actually occupying. And it's asking us to consider ourselves as Chicanexes, as settler colonialists. And it's like this huge shift that's happening right now, which then puts us in a much more uneasy relationship to decolonization than I think we were at when we wrote the book. But it's a really, I think, fruitful and important complication of the intervention that we're making. And so I think there's inklings in the book that I think we're in the right direction, and then there's places in the book that I think we were not as thoughtful as we could have been. And the inkling that I think was in the right direction is really to reflect on our position as Chicanexes in the United States in terms of how we should be in more active solidarity with American Indian communities and tribes and nations here, but also in Mexico. And so that we don't just say we're all indigenous as if because we're indigenous descended, we get to make that claim. And that's also with regards to food.
I think it's a really important point because we have a section on Civil Eats which is called Indigenous Foodways. And this question of who gets to define indigenous is really a critical one. And we've done a lot of reporting on pre-contact food, and there are a lot of chefs now from indigenous communities, so from different native communities who are really trying to bring these issues to the forefront through their cooking, but also through their writing. Folks like the sous chef, Sean Sherman, and people like Britt Reed, other chefs who have been really kind of vocal about being indigenous chefs. We did a story about Ohlone Cafe, and I know you just, Soleil, you just reviewed them here in Berkeley because we're on Ohlone land here. In your work for your next book, which I'm hearing might be happening, do you see that is going to be a deeper trend in terms of pulling out those threads and shedding more light on them?
Yeah, and we were very aware of the Native food movement as we were writing our book. And so those are threads that I think super informed us. And I think that what's going on now, and that group of chefs is actually very open to Chicanx chefs who are developing, reclaiming in their indigenous ancestors in their cooking. And so there's people like Claudia Cerrato in LA, who's been working really closely with Sean Sherman and others in this movement. And we're actually not going to be writing another book, but we're going to be supporting that next generation of chefs and writers who I think are going to take that next leap. And so we're really about passing and supporting to the next group of people who are doing this work in really interesting ways. And
I should mention that the sous chef Sean Sherman was just also nominated to be James Beard Foundation leader. They have leadership awards, and so he was recognized this year as well. Soleil, I want to move over to you. So much to talk about. You've been writing such incredible, really interesting reviews, and we talked a little bit before about some of the reaction to your reviews as well. I want to just back up a little bit because you've been really in this world for a while, as a chef, as a writer, for many years as a freelance writer, with your incredibly important and successful podcast. One of the things we talked about on the phone, I really wanted to kind of connect here for this audience, the audience at home, is the translation between the conversations you've been having in the podcast and this new medium as a food critic, and where you see there to be tension, opportunity, and challenge.
Sure, yeah. Can everyone hear me? Microphone's working? Oh, there we go. I had a feeling. I'll tell you about the reason why we started the podcast. So when I was a chef, I was really frustrated with the lack of a reliable outlet for stories about people of color in the food industry and in the food world. And so the solution was just to make one, right? You all can relate to this. And so we were having these conversations. We were the ones, I think, in our mind at the time, who were having, like 99% like people of color or like marginalized people in general on our show constantly, week after week, episode after episode. And so we were able to go past the, what's it like to be a black chef? What's it like to be, whatever, like a woman in the kitchen? That's basic, right? But because, when you are folded into these larger, mainstream food publications or whatever, that's like kind of the extent of the engagement with you and your life. And so we were able to have deeper conversations because we had more than one Korean American person on our show, for example. So we could talk about the individual experience. We could talk about, their differences too in the way they experience the world and in the food world. And so we found our audience pretty quickly because of that. People saw us as a reliable source for those sorts of stories that went beyond just that first impression. So the transition was really interesting because, as we know, the Chronicle is a mainstream publication, and the audience is vastly different. It came with a built-in audience. I didn't build this one. And so shifting that paradigm where I was so used to just talking to my people, and then just kind of opening up my, because over the years I became trained in having those conversations and like pushing those questions to people who were kind of ready to have those conversations. And so bringing that to the Chronicle has been really fascinating. I take the political aspect of food as an a priori assumption. And so there's been a bit of adjustment, especially because in food criticism, you can choose to either just talk about whether or not something was tasty, which is valid, or you can talk about systemic things. You can talk about history. You can talk about race and economics and climate change. But that's not very pleasant either. It's been fun.
And so you've been mentioning that people are kind of pushing back a little bit. Sort of, you're getting some people who are like, just stick to the food.
Yeah.
And what have you been saying to those folks?
I'm sorry you're disappointed.
That's a good response. You've been sort of known and I think in 2013 you wrote a great piece in Bitch about cultural appropriation. And I know in the conversation that you all had here with Samin Nosrat and Shakira Simley, one of the students asked a question about cultural appropriation. And so I want to ask you a few questions about it. I mean, you've written a number of pieces beyond that. You wrote a great piece more recently about Andrew Zimmern and his Lucky Cricket. This idea of what does cultural appropriation mean, and for you now, many years later, how has it changed? Is it morphing? Is it becoming something else?
It's morphed a lot. I feel like more and more people have become adept at talking about it.
Let's see what it is. Let's just talk about what is cultural appropriation.
Sure. So with regard to the essay that I wrote for Bitch back in 2013, I had noticed that there was a lot of, the way people talked about Vietnamese food changed from when I was a kid to when I was in college. And so that was where it came from. I realized that when I introduced myself and people were like, so where's your family from? First of all, that question sucks. But I would say, like, yeah, they're from Vietnam. We're Vietnamese. And then they would say, oh, I love pho. Pho's so good. And I would just be very confused because I hadn't heard that before. But people kept saying it over and over again. I was like, this is something. This is really interesting. And in the essay, I turn it around and say, like, well, if you introduce yourself and you say, like, you're white, like, should I just say, oh, I love tuna salad. I love egg salad. I love Coca-Cola, right? And so thinking about how food had become this vector of like identification, of like cultural trendiness and knowledge, I thought that was really fascinating. So cultural appropriation, what is it? To me, it is something that, like, in a vacuum is harmless, right? We exchange ideas. I wear your hat. I'm appropriating your hat, right? But if I steal your hat, that's a problem. Or if I say, oh yeah, I bought that hat. I invented that hat. That's a problem. That's the simplest way to explain it.
And so, like, for example, with Andrew Zimmern and Lucky Cricket, tell us a little bit about that piece you wrote, because I think that's a really important piece, and it happened before you came on at the Chronicle, but I really feel like it was kind of an important transition to your position at the Chronicle.
Yeah, no, the way that piece came together was really funny, but do we all know the story of this restaurant and Andrew Zimmern? Okay, great. So Andrew Zimmern is the host of Bizarre Foods with Andrew Zimmern on the Travel Channel. I just watch YouTube, I don't watch TV. So he has opened a Chinese restaurant in Minnesota, in the suburbs of Minneapolis, called Lucky Cricket. And he was doing, at the Minnesota State Fair, he was doing this interview with Fast Company, where he said that all of the Chinese restaurants are horseshit, and he's gonna save middle America from all this bad food with his restaurant. So of course, people had a problem with that. And this was just before his restaurant was opening that this interview came out. And so there's a video, you can watch the whole video, it's really fun. So the idea was I was gonna go, if he was going to, talk smack about all of these Chinese American entrepreneurs and families who opened restaurants so their kids could go to college and not work at restaurants. Let's see how he does, right? So the premise, right, of that appropriation was he was taking the food and making it and making money off of it while also demeaning the people from like who built that foundation for people to know like what chow mein was or what stir fry was in the United States. And so I went, and it was bad. I was really disappointed because I wanted to be surprised. I wanted it to be good, right? Because that's a more interesting story to me rather than like a pan. But it was bad, and so I had to figure out how I felt about it. But to me, the thing that really encapsulated the whole messed upness of it was the fried rice was terrible. It was terrible, it was badly cooked. There was no like wok hei in it, there was no charred taste to it, which is what I look for. It was bland. And the idea was like if his kitchen could not nail the simple, foundational, like Chinese American food thing, then what ground does he have to stand on?
And interestingly, when on one of your first set of reviews, you went up to Thomas Keller's new Mexican restaurant, Candela, and so now you are going in there with this notion that this is a Mexican restaurant run by a white chef, and what did you find?
I found that, and what informed a lot of my thinking about this was Samin Nosrat's show, Salt, Fat, Acid, Heat. And the fact that she made clear that all of these artisans and all of these craftspeople that she covers on the series, she wanted to build a bridge for people, viewers, to pay them for their goods. And that meant a lot to her, right? That was a huge part of her activism there. And so I went up there, I read the stories, did a lot of my research, and realized that there are all of these Mexican artisans who are being held up to the same sort of brand acknowledgement as Rydell and Heath Ceramics and all of these really boutique-y brands that we see a lot in the restaurant world here. And their names were on the website. That's the first thing you see when you go to the La Calenda website is the names of the people who made the pottery. And I thought that was really significant. That matters. And so thinking about cultural appropriation through that lens, right? Because to me, the idea behind it that I always go back to is who's getting money, who's getting paid, right now because we live in a capitalist society, right? That's what matters. Whose names are being floated out there and put on the forefront? And so those were the sort of questions that I brought when I went there.
And I want to turn to Stephen, but I want you to share also with folks about, you wrote a great piece about words you won't use in your reviews, one of which was authentic. And I was hoping maybe you say a few words about that and some of the other words that you decided you're not using in your reviews.
Sure, yeah. So I thought I'd have maybe one word, and that word would be ethnic, because when we talk about ethnic cuisine, what is under that umbrella? Is it a French restaurant? Or is it an Indian restaurant, or a Mexican restaurant, or Chinese restaurant? And I found ethnic being a word that was kind of used to denigrate a whole category of establishments run by people of color. So I didn't want to use that. Because I have a lot of power, right? I have the power to categorize and name things and judge things, and I try to use that as wisely as possible. So I'm very anxious. I'm a very anxious person, so I think about it a lot. The other words are also awful, like slutty. I don't use that word. I hear it a lot, though, surprisingly. I don't know if any of y'all have heard food being referred to as slutty, but it's so nasty. I don't get it. But there are food writers who use that term. And then I'm trying to think of other
Crack.
ones. Crack. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a bad one. People still use it, and this isn't me saying that words should be banned. That's not what I'm saying. I'm just saying I myself am not going to use those words as a thought leader in the industry. And hopefully people follow suit, and at least not follow what I'm saying as a directive, but just think about the words that they're using, because that matters, obviously.
Yeah, words do matter. And with that, I want to kind of transition to talk to Stephen, because Stephen is really leading the charge as a Black publisher in this very narrow food world. And Stephen, you had this, the piece that we shared with the students was in Chef's Feed in 2017. It was called, "I'm a Black Food Writer, Here's Why We Need More Like Me," on the power of representation and its ability to illuminate a shared story. You had kind of a really interesting Twitter feed back in the beginning of the year, and I just was hoping you could share that. I mean, it was like a moment where you were just telling the world what it's like to be a Black food publisher.
I'm sure I was salty about something. I was pissed off.
I have it here if you'd like me to read it.
Yeah, maybe. No telling which day or what was going on.
I have tweets. I have tweets, people.
This
It's
is like a
not up
late
there.
night show right here. Yeah, so what do you got? Are you gonna
Okay,
read the tweet,
I'm going to
or-
read it.
Okay.
So, January 2019. If asked what makes Whetstone different, I will ask you to name one other Black publisher. We are different because I am. We are different because most media we consume is on white-owned platforms with white curators. Even with diverse contributors, fundamentally, it's the same. And you go on to talk about how you've been feeling increasingly isolated.
Mm-hmm. That's right. I mean, it is tiresome for me to have other, I'm sure well-meaning people, but other people in our field of food media in this moment of heightened consciousness, or at least purportedly heightened consciousness, look me in the face and ask, like, well, what makes your magazine special? You know, I have a lot of other things that I could say as it relates to the contents of the magazine, but I think more fundamentally, the fact that they're missing what I feel to be kind of the point is really tiresome.
Well, and it's also, I mean, one thing that you and I have talked about a lot is that media is very loath to report on other media. And when you have been reported on, I mean, you were included in like a roundup of other magazines. So like the trend of, you know, returning to print in the New York Times or in the Chronicle recently, without really sort of going deep into the publication itself and what you're trying to do. So I would love for you to just talk to everybody here. What are you doing with Whetstone, and what does make it different?
Yeah. I think that, you know, one thing that is being missed right now is that we are a media company and not just a print magazine. So in addition to independently releasing 4 print magazines without advertising or any outside capital, we have also released a short film, which took basically 2 years to make, which was self-funded, called Wild Grapes. It was about the origins of wine in the Republic of Georgia. We've also released a number of short video dispatches from all over the world. One from a fishing village in the Gambia in West Africa, one about Ceylon tea, one from Cambodia. So, you know, from the very beginning, I think the vision for Whetstone was always to have a very worldly sensibility in the media that we put out. There are many outlets who are far more resourced who have really done an inadequate job of authentically representing stories from different parts of the world. And I feel that, you know, we are really leading in that space. So, you know, I think, not to say like people should be reporting or writing about us, but I do find the dissonance between what is upheld and celebrated in mainstream media outlets through press releases, through announcements, through goodwill that is generated just by saying, we're gonna now hire writers of color. And they want to be lauded for this. They want to be applauded for this. And they are just kind of continuously pushing this halo that goes over their head because they're increasing the voices who have been previously marginalized. Meanwhile, the people who are amplifying the reputation of the publications are themselves being paid, you know, a couple $100s at a time. They might see that money 6 months down the road, and they have no real equity. Nothing within the power structure has changed. And so when you have a Black publisher, you know, I have a business partner who's a Chinese American woman. You know, she worked in finance before. She faced many of the same issues around being shut out of her respective communities and opportunities. And so, you know, the story that they really want to write about is right in front of their faces. And so it's either a lack of, you know, intellectual curiosity, or they're really just kind of uncomfortable with what it means to actually talk about the politics of a Black publisher.
How do you sort of transcend this desire to sort of check the brown box with, you know, you want to have more diversity, you want to have more inclusion. I know that was the previous conversation between Samin and Shakira. You know, you want to have more people on the staff at the San Francisco Chronicle, at major dailies, at other publications, and at the same time, who are the people in the positions of power? I mean, we're very aware of that as civil leads, right? I mean, it is female founded. We are largely a white staff, but for over the years we've done, I think, a pretty valiant effort to try to cultivate writers of color and bring people into the conversation so we can actually have a very diverse conversation.
Yeah, I was one of the writers that was cultivated. Naomi has worked with me extensively to improve my writing and my voice to help better articulate our point of view. So I'm grateful for that. You know, I think you hit on it. Like, basically, it's not the same discussion. I find that when I'm having earnest discussions about changing things that are currently inequitable, those conversations they're much harder. They're about, how do we change these systems of power? How do we really change the inner workings of these institutions? Conversations that I'm not moved by are, no offense, but like panels on cultural appropriation. I'm moved by you all, and I'm happy to be here. But I mean, like, you know, these kinds of conversations where we are within institutions and there's a very like self-congratulatory tone about having Black and brown people centered for whatever reason, but ultimately I feel like this really benefits the institution. And that benefit isn't necessarily a one-to-one. And so for me, I'm like, if y'all want to support my work, like, you could support my work. Like, no one has ever really supported my work. We haven't had advertisers, not because I've ever come out and said we're anti-advertising. I've sent out pitch decks. You know, I've gone to the same companies that all your faves that you hear on the podcast, that you see in other magazines, you know, of equal quality. Like, we've hit those people up, and for whatever reason, they haven't hit us back, and that's okay, because it makes us more efficient, and ultimately I feel that's gonna be to our advantage in the long run, you know, being able to scrap it out. But it is really exhausting, I find, as someone who is in the media and myself adjacent to this power. Like, I'm not saying that I am out. The fact that I'm here says so much about what kind of networks I'm already in or a part of, right? But even for me, the fact that there is a kind of barrier to entry that I still can't break is so telling for other people who are truly outside of these systems and networks of power.
Yeah, no, I agree, because Racist Sandwich is lauded as a podcast, but like we had such trouble finding advertising. Maybe we're awful at it, but I don't know. But the only advertisers we had consistently were a black winemaker in Oregon, major props to Bertoni Foston, and People's Food Co-op in Portland, and like that was it. People dropped us once they heard the content. So that was really hard. And we found community funding, but Kickstarters and all that stuff are so exhausting.
But those same brands will underwrite a food conference and ask you to pay, or ask you to be on the panel.
Yeah.
So I mean, so what we're talking about is some, kind of self-congratulating and back patting and some tokenization, right? Like they're happy to include you in a conversation that sort of allows them to say we are broadening the conversation. But what we're talking about is actually, it also comes to this, which is like the power systems and really understanding that actually, and we've talked about this greatly on Soleil, but that the food system itself is built on a system of oppression and racism. And until you really understand that, we are just living in the legacy of that really dark shadow, actually. And so how do you guys sort of navigate? Like we were talking before about the fact that the LA Times has 2 new reporters, and there's a New York Times has a food reporter of color as well, and there's sort of new critics who are coming on the scene, who are kind of taking old roles and changing the narrative, like you guys are. What is it going to take to kind of push the larger mechanisms to have systemic change? I don't have the answer to this myself, but I mean, you guys working, and especially in your work also, what are you guys seeing that you feel would make a difference? I mean, for the average person, I mean, what could the average person do? What should they be doing? Who should they be reading? What should they be supporting?
It's complicated, right? Because even though I have a platform now, and all of these other writers that you mentioned at the LA Times, New York Times have different platforms, larger platforms as well, we're still in danger of being tokenized, because you can list our like marginalizations and prove that that is progress, but very few people actually engage with our individual politics also and think about the content of what we're doing and what we're trying to change in the conversation. I don't end at being a queer Asian woman. There's other things.
Right, because we talked about that because there was a profile of you in the Washington Post, and that was sort of the lead, right? It was like that, and that's not just how you identify, right? So on one hand, that is who you are, and it's not something you're hiding, not proud of. But then on the other hand, if that's the sole lens through which people are seeing you, I mean, how do you navigate that tricky space?
It's the space that I am put into, right? And it's also one that I volunteered into because I could have said no to the job also. But it's the same thing as lauding Whetstone for being a black-owned, black published magazine, but not actually talking about what's in the pages, right? That's what's interesting. I mean, that's all the other stuff is interesting too. But what's in the pages, and I'm not just saying this because I am also in the pages, but that's fun. I mean, that will actually push conversations because there's so many ideas in all of that content and all of that work. And then we build on that work to come up with new ideas and new conversations rather than, oh yeah, just queer.
I mean, Luz, maybe you can jump in here too, because I feel like so much of this conversation is happening on social media. And not everybody is on social media. Are you finding, like in your own progress, in terms of your process rather, that you have learned and have sort of reevaluated some of your thinking, are you guys all seeing sort of any evolution, I guess I would say, in some of this, at least on social media, if not in the actual pages of publications or in large-scale media publications?
Yeah, I mean, for me, I feel like an elder now. And so like as an elder, I feel like that the way that I can keep track of what's going on with young people, which is important to me because I teach them, but also because like that's our future, is through social media. And so I learn so much from following different voices on social media.
So who do you follow? Like,
so then I follow like small producers of cultural content. So like the fat activists. I follow Native Mexican people who identify as Zapotec or Raramuri, Yaqui, who are on social media, who are critiquing discourses of decolonization from that point of view. So, I mean, it's kind of very targeted who I follow, and then I follow, other political strands of things that I'm interested in. So that for me is a way I see young people really being able to marshal social media in a way that I think is really productive, and that often then I see it trickling up into mainstream media. It's a slow trickle. I mean, I know right now Remezcla, which is a Latino platform, is soliciting people to write on what just happened at Mecha. So it's very current and it's super helpful, and I feel like that's where the real stuff is happening as opposed to the more mediated platforms. That's what I'm seeing, but I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, like the thing about social media too is access, right? Like not everyone has access to this room, but they can access Twitter or Facebook or whatever. I think the smartest follow I ever made, that's the worst sentence, I'm sorry. But like the best person I've followed on social media in the past year is Alice Wong, the disability activist who does this podcast called Disvisibility. She's fantastic. She's been one of the really big voices in the conversation about the straw ban, for example, and talking about just the way people who are like disabled people experience the world, and that is not something that I know much about from firsthand experience. And so that helped fill the gaps for me, because I assumed a lot of things about the way people exist in a restaurant space, for instance, and having these conversations with her were really helpful.
And on social media. What about you, Stephen?
Yeah, I'm on there somewhat reluctantly sometimes, when I need to get some steam off, it sounds like. We, as a media company, we are always thinking about how we're showing up there. Honestly, right now for Whetstone, we're in a somewhat fortunate position that all of our magazines, the core print product for us, we have had some success selling direct-to-consumer and retail. And so it's allowed us to think more strategically about not just social media, but all of our communications at large, really how we want to harness those assets, which we're very much in the process of right now. And yeah, I mean, for me personally, I'm a fiend for information. So I'm on social in the way that it's still like generational for me. And also there is a lot of information out there. I'm often overwhelmed at the volume and underwhelmed at the quality. And so, it just makes me really want to think about how to bring more resources to our work so that we can resource and put on other people, get on and put on, I always say. And just to answer the previous question about how do you really kind of break down these power structures, it's an all hands on deck approach, Black folks, people of color, we've been dealing with this exceptionalism clause since we were introduced to these white supremacist systems and networks. You don't get to exist or advance in the next round of a white supremacist institution without some measure of assimilating or dealing with. So I think, to get on the stage in these situations, to get in the room, to get these jobs, we've already dealt with so much bullshit. I mean, we're so adept in a sense at just maintaining our own sense of self and identity, but also being able to take in stride the inherent, even if it's not, sort of more benevolent ignorance or, in worst cases, racism that we deal with. But, we need Soleil we need you to have your spot at the Chronicle, like that's good for business for all of us, right? But we also need Whetstone Magazine and Whetstone Media to exist, because we are kind of trying to upset these structural imbalances from a completely different way. And as we did in this latest volume of Whetstone, this is why I'm so proud of the work that we're doing. We had an opportunity to collaborate with Soleil, which is like, that's how we should be getting down. We're in community, Soleil is supporting our work, we can be a part of her wave, and we get to remain independent and know that we have the most important and rigorous voices in our industry are still showing up and representing for Whetstone, even when we don't have the same audience as LA Time or Bon Appetit or whatever.
And in fact, I think you've said in the article in the Chronicle that almost a large part of your contributors are women and women of color.
Yeah, and that's really like, I don't really lead with that. It's not, again, everybody else is leading with it. Like, that's not really, it just is reflective of the people that I'm in community with and with my friends, like the people that I spend time with are ultimately, they look like the magazine. And so that's why, going back to this idea of what makes it different, if I was a cis white male editor, like we wouldn't have the same magazine, the bylines would be way different. And that's not to diminish like what that looks like. It looks like every other magazine you've seen out there. It just means when you have different voices who have been able to, because of their own privilege, harness power, create their own independent text, independent and autonomous of these power structures, like the voices are gonna be way different. And that's why it's really important to me that we stay independent.
I want to talk a little bit about sort of the places you get inspiration and sort of places you're looking. You obviously were sharing some of the social sites that are informing you. Soleil, you had said to me a little bit about, you were sort of really intrigued by the eater package on Chinese dining and on WeChat, and I was hoping you could talk a little bit about that.
Oh, sure. Yeah, so there was this Chinese food package, this group of stories on Eater about Chinese food in New York City. And one of the stories really struck me, and it was about how all of these Chinese restaurateurs and Chinese American eaters and transplants were not reading the traditional food media. They weren't reading the New York Times food section or Eater or Bon Appetit, but they were looking for reviews on like Weibo and WeChat. I thought that was really interesting. Like, there's a whole universe, and I love the idea, like intellectually, of like different internets and different worlds on the internet. I think it's just fabulous, and that they don't have any stock in stars or the James Beard Awards or any of that nonsense. They have their own world, and that world was what matters to them financially and just socially. I thought that was fantastic, and so it keeps me humble. Also, right, because not everyone cares about what I write, and that's just got to be fine. And so I go to seek out all of this stuff and all of this media that is not like in English, because that is a whole world unto itself that matters to so many people. And so I'm super into TikTok right now. There are these like videos that I can't even read any of this stuff, but there are these cooking videos of like Chinese people cooking in the countryside, like next to rivers and like in snowy mountains, and that's the stuff that I'm jamming on.
That's great. What about you guys? Are there other places you're gaining inspiration? Places that you think this room needs to know about, people out on the internet?
What am I rocking with? I rock with Ghetto Gastro from the Bronx. They're kind of like a culinary collective, I guess you could call them, led by this dude named John Gray. It's like a quartet of chefs, all black chefs. One of them is an alumni of NOMA. And so I think John has maybe like a fashion background or something.
Say a little bit about NOMA for those who might not know.
Oh yeah, so by many accounts, it's a restaurant in Copenhagen. led by a very famous chef, Rene Redzepi, arguably one of the most important chefs of this generation. Noma is a hugely important restaurant, often regarded as maybe the best in the world. And there's this young black chef from the Bronx who I think was there in 2015 around when your book came out. And he took that experience as a pastry chef. He worked at some high-end restaurants in New York before that, and these guys came together as a collective. But what I really love about them is like they kind of have nothing to do with the food world, but also everything to do with it, and that like the pedigree is there. And I think they've just been really smart about how they've leveraged the access and the relationships that they do have, but with such like clarity of vision around how to keep their own movement like really authentic to who they are.
Luz, what about you?
Maybe I want to lift up a group in New York as well that I came in contact with when I was curating a art exhibit at Galeria de la Raza in San Francisco on food as medicine, and it's Queer Canning Brigade, and it's CUIR, which is the Spanish spelling of queer as it's coming up, and it's a group of Puerto Rican activists who started home canning as an act of solidarity to send food to Puerto Rico. And so they have a zine, and they have like a whole system of getting their food to Puerto Rico, and they have these canning parties, and they're just super awesome with a real clear sense of their political vision in relation to food and solidarity with a group that's going through a lot.
We just have a few more minutes before we open it to questions and answers. I want to just ask you guys what advice you would give your former self, your younger self, right? Put yourself back in the chairs and the seats of this auditorium of these students. Before you guys knew you were going to be writers and thinkers, what do you wish somebody had told you or advised you? What would have helped? Besides, it's going to be okay.
For me, my career path was all over the place because I graduated during the recession in 2009, and so I ended up working on a farm just to see what would happen and wait for things to blow over, and then they didn't blow over. And so I kept doing all these random things. So I guess what I would tell myself is that in retrospect, all of that would coalesce into something that made sense, into like a central thesis.
I think I would say when you get that sense that you're onto something, like trust it, even in the face of everybody else telling you, nah. Like if you get that strong sense, just keep going.
I mean, I think about the fact that a lot of my ideas haven't really changed that much. I think, I'm kind of stubborn like that. And, but I'm not just saying this so you can close your ears if you want to, but the best advice that I ever got about food media came from you. And that is really just about a very real level, or a high level of realness, maybe, about what it would really take to make it independently, but also advocating for that kind of disposition and that approach in a way that really, meant a lot to me and really resonated with me. At that time, I was managing a restaurant in San Francisco who very fortunately, supported my interest as kind of a media maker in the food space. We did a lot of work about, the Bay Area at large, the local food community here, but a lot of those skills and interests that I was developing, through this restaurant was really validated when Naomi told my boss at the time, like, Steven's actually really doing like kind of amazing work for you. You should like support this even more than you already are. And that became my full-time job. And I really got to see, through Nopalize and that experience, how much work would be required kind of having your own independent thing that existed outside of these networks, but also just how valuable and powerful that could be as well.
I'm going to open it to questions now, and we have 2 questions, and I'd love to call the students to the microphone if they'd be willing to. So we have a question from Jasmine, if she's here.
So I have a question for you guys. When reading your article, I started to realize where it pertained into my lane. I'm a Latina amateur food writer, and I'm trying to look for jobs in that right now. And I started to realize there's not that many of us up at the mainstream. I can think of 4 or 5 Latinx that have made it, but there is not a lot of us in that media space. And I want to ask, how can people of color who are interested in food writing and food industry and food media, how can we make our place in there and be taken seriously? Because it's obviously very taken up by, people at the top, they're white, and we don't have a lot of space there. So how do we carve our way in there and be valid and hear our voices in there?
Do you have a blog?
I have a blog. I'm also a food writer for 2 different publications right now.
Oh, cool.
So I'm working really hard at
You're on
this.
it. I mean, that's honestly the truth is no one is really going to advocate for you until they do. And you can just be pleasantly surprised if that happens. But from my experience, the only thing that is acknowledged, unfortunately, is just a really high volume and a high quality of work, which can be developed, I feel, when you have a lot of repetition and improving your craft and your networks. It's your best way to get the work noticed. It's uncertain, I think, but if you have your own kind of channel that you can continue to grow and learn, and as you're doing already, developing your skills on someone else's dollar is a great way to go about it. So I think you're doing a great job. You just gotta be patient and keep going.
I would also say, as someone who's extremely online, that having interactions with editors and publishers is really important too. There are a lot of editors that I worked with because I saw what they were posting online, like calls for pitches, right? I saw it and sent out an email 5 minutes later. That sort of thing is really important just to be on top of. It makes you feel kind of nuts, but it's also really important, just the networking of it, right? Because you don't have to be in New York City to network with these editors at these publications. You can do it online too.
Are you following anybody in particular, or would they just be different calls for submissions that you were watching?
The Writers of Color Twitter is also extremely important for a lot of beginners, and they publicize everything. And a lot of editors will tag them when they have these calls as well. Sometimes they tag them on things that are stupid, but that's fine. You just have to learn how to weed through it. But really just having these connections, keeping tabs on everyone, really. There's a little bit of subterfuge in it, but just making sure that have spreadsheets, know what each of these editors wants, what they're looking for, what their email is, and how to talk to them. That'll help.
And I can say as an editor, that does make a huge difference. Just having somebody having read your site or know what you're looking for and having a very specific pitch makes a big difference. Are you on binders by chance?
No.
I will talk to you about that afterwards.
Thank you.
Okay.
I think I want to add, having a community of other Latinx people who are involved in food in one way or another is, I think, really critical. So starting to follow people on Twitter or Facebook or Instagram or there's a whole world out there in Latinx food Instagram that I think is worth following. And then, it's just I have made so many connections just by leaving a comment and then get a follow back, and you start creating a virtual community that then when your piece comes out, you have a readership. And I mean, we started with the Facebook group that really then that platform grew quite large, that then helped us finally get the book contract. So I think like just start, I mean, that's how we started as non-food people entering into a food kind of arena. But there's people out there who would love to know that you exist and that you would be the one reviewing their business and their restaurant. And I think making connections to those people is important.
Thank you so much.
Thank
Thanks.
We have another question from. You have a question from Liv?
Hi, thank you so much for being here. I was reading the articles presented this past spring break where I was visiting family in Texas, so the question's inspired by that. And the question regards Viet Cajun food. It's a combination of Vietnamese and Cajun cooking. It's mind-blowingly delicious. I like careened off the 610 in Houston to go to Cajun and Noodles, which is really good. But it was really interesting to read your articles and kind of juxtapose it with the changing dynamics in a state like Texas and in a community like Houston, where the food is a product of many communities and it's a cultural item kind of reflective of these changes. And so the question that I have is, what kind of a role can food play in connecting communities of different cultures, races, socioeconomic and immigration statuses through food? And I'm not at all talking about the idea of fusion food or in assimilated food, but really in food that connects authentically in a way that resonates with the larger community.
Man, I've always wanted to try Viet Cajun food too, so I'm so mad we got to go to this like legendary crawfish and noodles place. But yeah, actually today I was talking to a friend who goes to Vietnam a lot. She's Vietnamese too, and she said that they're making Cajun Vietnamese crawfish in Vietnam now. Like there's this bridge that's been built across the ocean from Texas to Saigon, which is so fascinating, right?
Yeah.
And I think a lot about how, I lived in New Orleans for a bit too, about how the seafood industry received a lot of Vietnamese refugees after 1975, and that was how they made a living. And that was just how they got on their own feet economically and really carved out their own communities by taking control of like certain aspects of the seafood industry there and owning it, you know, actually having a piece of that pie. And I think when we talk about the foods that unite us, right, I think when we find commonalities like that, we feel like we belong more, especially as immigrants and refugees. Like, oh, I recognize this, let's have a conversation, you know?
Yeah, you know, I think it's tricky for me. I'm really weary of people using this very powerful idea that you're describing as some sort of a trope. I see it presented in really lazy fashion, often in journalism.
There's so much boring food writing about it.
I mean, yeah, right? So like, and on the one hand, I think we kind of already have this understanding that this can be a potentially transformative way of connecting and understanding. So the manifestations of that, I think, are really as endless as our own imaginations. But ultimately, it is about facilitating opportunities for direct engagement around food. And I think the more space that you allow for food and the experiences and histories and stories and lessons around them to be shared as a real exchange is hugely powerful and impactful. And I think especially when we, as privileged people from the United States, have the ability to move freely around the world and be a part of those experiences, like that's really deep and transformational. But you know, when I see it presented in an editorial sense, my skepticism lies in that, you know, a lot of what we're talking about, you know, it doesn't really address the underlying circumstances of how these two cultures came together, or, you know, all of the events that led up to these cultures coming together. And so you can just say, oh, well, isn't it nice that food brings us all together, without really having to do any of the intellectual lifting around like how these two disenfranchised communities could have ended up, you know, side by side, for instance. Yeah, I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a good question. It reminded me just of this small business in my neighborhood. I live in the Fruitvale in Oakland. And a couple of years ago, a Filipino family started Lucky 7, which is just like a super, do you know this place? It's and it drew the whole community. It's a very humble kind of order at the window, facing right onto Fruitvale. Right, the first sign of it was like, you know, they started painting, and like just like the colors were like, everybody's like, what's going on here? What's going on here? And then it opened up, and that place is just a hub of activity in our community. And it's a very multiracial community of Asian folks, Filipino folks, Latino folks, and Black folks. And that place is always hopping. And it's later when people, Hasta Muerte, which is a anarchist cafe, opened a few blocks down, you know, a little while later. But that place there, and it was an empty spot, and people in the community were saying like, well, what should go here? And to me, it was like, well, we have a model of like what should go here through Lucky 7, because that's a place that is not gentrifying. It's not gentrifying the neighborhood. It's actually bringing people out to eat together. And that's the tricky part in a neighborhood that's under all this pressure right now, vis-a-vis gentrification.
Thanks for your question. Go ahead.
I'm surprised we just had that conversation and no one mentioned David Chang. Interesting. I would be so curious to hear all of your thoughts on that, but that's not why I'm here. That's abusing my GSI power. I am keeping an eye for our viewers on YouTube that have been very engaged throughout this session. And someone had a question earlier that I thought would be good to share. Is it inappropriate or disrespectful, particularly in relationship to the body positive zone and other kind of conversations like that, to share information on the poor nutritional quality of items such as soda and snacks, makers of which target disadvantaged communities? And kind of the conversation thereof of how do you hold that tension between companies that intentionally target our communities, education around that, but also being respectful of people and their choices.
Yeah.
Very good question. I'll just start with this one because I feel I've been very outspoken regarding like the soda tax that landed here in Berkeley in the past. So, you know, for me as an African American person, as many of my brothers and sisters have experienced firsthand the unfortunate byproducts of our family members, you know, who are unfortunately reliant on these industrial food products which are barely even food, and namely soda. And so we have to really understand the ways in which these industries not only are not representing our own best interests, but are explicitly profiting off of our poor health. And so what it means to me as a Black person in the food space, when I talk about these issues, I'm really trying to talk about our own preservation, our own health and wellness. And I would never admonish anyone for the choices that they're making around it. What you're trying to do is actually introduce a new level of consciousness around what we're actually up against. and how what we're up against is not some benevolent force, but actually an industry who for decades have profited off of the deaths that I know that they know what I'm talking about. And so that's really kind of how I align, my own thoughts or politics around talking about sugar and soda. The reasons in which we don't have adequate access or education around these issues is not an indictment on the people who are victimized by these systems. It's incumbent on me and others like me, I feel, to talk about the ways in which these systems have been so damaging to our health, and how we can try to fight and advocate for our own different outcomes through diet, through nutrition, and in this case, through policy.
Bravo. I think when you're talking about a political analysis, it's very different than when you're talking about, at an individual level, what people should or should not do. And I think that we have to hold up a political critique and talk about what a food-for-profit model produces. And that's what we're in. Capitalism produces food for profit above all else. And that's different than what our ancestors did, which was to produce food for health and healing and nourishment and celebration and pleasure. And I think that critique, we have to keep that critique, in our minds at all time.
I guess my advice too would be, if you're having this conversation and you're in this conversation and you feel like there's a lot of this individual moralizing or admonishment, take a step back and just zoom out. And that will give you a sense of okay, wait, but beyond this individual action, what is compelling us to this action? What is putting this food on the shelf right now? What is keeping this food cheap, just out and out and out and out? And that's where you start to have more meaningful conversations.
Any other questions? Go ahead, yeah.
This isn't quite related with food, but twice during the conversation, you guys used white supremacist in I guess a more broader sense than I'm used to. And I guess I'd just like to hear what y'all's thought on, or definition, or broader, I don't know, it kind of struck me, I think at one point it was white supremacists are pushing kale salads, and that's not something that I typically associate with white supremacists, and so clearly you're thinking about it at a different point than I am, so I'd love to hear your perspective.
So I'm going to start with the story. And this was documented by George Sanchez, who's a Chicano historian. And at the turn of the century, they sent reformers out to Mexican families in the LA area and taught them that they should stop feeding their children corn tortillas and instead send them to school with sandwiches made on white bread. And actually in the discourse, it said that a life of eating corn tortillas will lead to a life of crime, because the child will come with their empty corn tortilla and be jealous of the white kids with their bread, white bread sandwiches, and this will create all this jealousy. And so that's obviously a white supremacist ideology in relation to food, that an American way of eating is going to be superior to the ancestral, thousands of years our people had of making these delicious and nutritious corn tortillas and filling them with beans, which makes a complete and nourishing meal. So my dad was actually put in what was called taken out of second grade, and they put all the Mexican kids in what they called the sunshine room, where they fed them orange juice and gave them showers for a year instead of progressing on. So these programs actually lasted well into the 1930s and 1940s. So it's that history that I am kind of evoking when I talk of white supremacy in relation to food systems, where there's this belief, there's actual there's capitalism for one, where there's food for profit, but then there's this white supremacist system that is, an Americanized version of healthy food is superior to the ancestral knowledge that different communities of color come with, which is actually equally as valid. And so the kale is like just the modern example of that. My students think that in order to eat healthy, my Latinx students, who are mostly first generation college students and first generation in this country, they think that in order to eat healthy, they have to have a kale salad. And so when I tell them, like, actually beans and tortillas and tamales are perfectly healthy, nourishing foods, like, no one has told, that is information they have never received from anywhere before, which seems kind of outrageous. So that's my take on it, and that's obviously I have a lot of feelings about it, so yeah.
Soleil, do you all have any?
I think for me, when I talk about white supremacy, I think about the unconscious, right? More than just direct action and more than just explicit, violence. Like I can smack someone in the face, right? That is like an ideology, something's happening. But more, what I'm thinking about a lot when I talk about it is a series of assumptions, a series of assuming what is default, what is normal. And within white supremacy, normal is white, right? When we think about what normal food is, what American food is, that's all informed by all of these ideologies that are kind of simmering below the surface of everyday life.
Yeah, I think, I would really implore you to sit with the question and to do even a cursory amount of research, because what we're talking about is something that is so incredibly pervasive that it's like we might as well be talking about oxygen in the room right now. Because what we're talking about fundamentally is what we've been talking about all night, which is a power structure, and really more accurately, a power imbalance that was created and defined specifically with the intended byproduct of disenfranchising people who were not white. And that still continues to be an issue in this country and in many countries all over the world, whether that relates to one's identity and peace of mind or wellness and safety or health, as we're discussing here. And so it may seem like a stretch, to imagine the ways in which white supremacy and kale belong in the same sentence. But I think you'll find in your research that there's not many sentences that you can construct about this country where white supremacy wouldn't be at the forefront.
Thank you.
Thanks for the question. We have time for one more question. We have 1 minute. Somebody with a burning question, yes.
So I read the San Francisco Chronicle, in which your magazine was talked about just a couple weeks ago, the Whetstone, and I ran to issues in Oakland that it's supposed to be at, and they were out. And I was, oh really? Okay, that's so cool. I was really excited, and I got to talk to the owner about it, and I can't wait to finally get my hands on one. But I want to know, what do you hope to grow with your publication, or move on to other things that you can accomplish with that voice?
Yeah, we're interested and have already started making media on all platforms. So the same energy and enthusiasm that we have around print, we are trying to realize as filmmakers, as audio producers, as event and experience producers, which is really, I think, not unique to us. If you look at any media company in 2020, really we have to be looking at ways to fund our work, and diversification is a big part of that, and meeting people where they are is a big part of that. So making content across platforms and being able to find the resources to do that is kind of at the forefront.
Thank you.
But yeah, I have a magazine, and thanks for going to Issues. I appreciate it.
So please join me in a round of applause for our incredible guests.
And thank you very much to Naomi for facilitating this wonderful discussion. I feel bad every week that I end class because this is so unexciting to make announcements and do attendance. I think particularly after this class was incredibly inspiring. I was able to see comments from guests online. My dad joined in. And just really, really exciting to see and hear your voices. So thank you very much for being here. We appreciate it. Okay, so on to the boring things. I wrote it down this week because I was worried I was gonna forget. The farm trip is on for this Sunday at 10 a.m. I have people signed up. We are in desperate, desperate need of drivers. So if you drive and want to join in, please email me. If you have access to a car or creative ways on how to transport your classmates, please send me an email and I'll send out an email to everyone signed up, hopefully by Friday, just confirming all of the details. I'm sure you guys are very excited for our final essay. We're working on it right now. We think we have a great question, and that will be sent out to you before class next week, and I'll go over the details there. Finally, for some reason, you guys want to hear my voice even more. So we are going to do a discussion section. It will be on Friday, April 26th. I will send out an announcement about that soon, and it'll be here on Haas's campus. So that said, let's do Kahoot. It's always sad to me when the sound isn't on because I really think that's the most exciting part, but it's okay. All right, for those of you who don't know what Kahoot is, that means that you don't have to worry about it because you're not getting credit to attend this class. For those of you who are, you know what to do. As always, just a reminder, if for some reason you miss it or you think you have a problem, please come see me after class. It's so much easier to fix it right now than it is to do it later. And let's do this. All right, don't forget you need to answer to get credit. Feel free to answer in whatever way you don't. I don't actually look at who answered what, so be honest, because I think it's interesting. Awesome. All right, thanks everybody. Have a great week.